Chapter 29, the overview of the weak verb and R1 guttural verbs. As we start chapter 29, we enter into a new section of the grammar, and that is we're now looking at the weak verb. If you go back to chapter 22, section 1, I define a weak verb. A weak verb has a weak letter in it, and that is defined as a guttural letter, either as your R1, R2, or R3. Also, if you have a yod or a vav in a word, again, whether in the R1, R2, R3 position. Also, if you have a nun in the word. And also, if you have the word ending in identical consonants at the end of a word. In any of those situations, you have what's called a weak verb. What you've learned so far, up through chapter 28, is the strong verb. And then, of course, you attached pronominal suffixes in the last two chapters onto strong verbs. But now we go to the most difficult aspect of the Hebrew language, and that is the weak verb. And of course, I call it the Mount Everest. If you can ascend this mountain, there's no other mountain quite like this one. So the weak verb is the most difficult aspect. If you can conquer this mountain, then really the syntax of Hebrew is not that difficult. I classify the weak verb into 10 categories, and if you look at section 1, I give you those 10 categories. If you notice, the first 5 deal with gutturals. So you either have a guttural in the first position or the second position or the third position. I'm talking about root positions. And then starting in number 6, you have the R1 nun verbs, where you have a nun in the first position. And then as you go 7 through 9, you have either a vav or a yod in the first, second, or third root positions. And then finally, you have something called a geminate verbs. And that's geminate has the idea of twins. And that is the last 2 letters are identical. You can see in my example there you have 2 baits, savav. That's a geminate verb. So these are the weak verbs. Then I classify the weak verbs by the affected syllable. And you can see that the boxes, if you look at that section in your book, that the boxes are basically affected with R1 guttural, R2 guttural, R1 nun, R1 vav yod. That will affect the first syllable of a word, and again it'll affect the boxes basically. And then your colors affects usually the second syllable or third syllable rarely, and you can see that's an R3 guttural, R3 aleph, R3 vav yod. And then finally you have certain weak verbs that affect all syllables, and there you see the first one, aleph special cases, the R2 vav yod, and the geminate verbs, and again that will affect both the first syllable and the second syllable. Something else you need to know about weak verbs, and that is you can have what's called doubly weak verbs. What I've listed in those 10 different weak verbs, there's just one weakness in the verb, but you can actually have instances where there are 2 weaknesses in a given root. And so in the example that I give you, you can have a word like chata, and in this example here, you have an R1 guttural, the chet, but then you have an R3 aleph. And with this, you have what's called a doubly weak verb, and we will see some of those also. So that's something else that you need to keep in mind. Well, the first weak verb that we want to look at is the R1 guttural verb. And so the way we're going to tackle all of these weak verbs is we're going to see these weaknesses as if they're infirmities, if they're sicknesses, and you are the doctor, and so we're going to have to give you certain remedies. And then you're going to have to affect the cure. You're going to have to apply the cure to these forms. And so that's the way we're going about doing these. And so with every weak verb that we do, we will look at the infirmity or the sickness of the verb. We'll look at also the strong areas where it's totally healthy verb, as it were. And then again, we will look at how to cure that weakness in the verb. So that's how we're going to do it. So the first thing we want to do here is look at section 2 of chapter 29 and look at the weaknesses or the infirmities of R1 guttural verbs. Well, as you remember from chapter 5, verse 7, gutturals have certain problems, and those problems basically consist of 2 major problems. And that is a dagesh problem and a shva problem. And so when we come to R1 guttural verbs, that's what the problem really is going to be. And so the first problem, of course, is a dagesh forte problem. As you know, gutturals will not take a dagesh forte, and so what we're going to get is a rejection of the dagesh and a lengthening of a vowel. And so Dagesh forte will not take a Dagesh forte. So that's one of the problems, one of the weaknesses which we're going to have to apply a remedy. The second problem is a vocal schwa problem. And again, you're used to this. With a normal, strong consonant, you would get a simple vocal schwa. But with a guttural, instead of getting a simple vocal schwa, you'll get a composite schwa. And again, that's going to basically be the remedy for that. But now we have another problem with schwa, and this is the silent schwa problem. Where normally we expect a silent schwa, we're going to get a composite schwa. Now this is not unique to what we've done so far. If you go back to chapter 16, with the seglet nouns with a guttural, especially a guttural in the R2 position, we had that same problem, that you would expect a silent schwa, but instead of getting that silent schwa, you ended up with a vocal schwa. And so if you remember the word, for instance, na'ar, like this, and we would attach a pronominal suffix, this is what you would expect the answer to be. But remember, the guttural in a silent schwa position would end up taking a composite schwa. And then really, we're going to apply the same rule that we learned with seglet nouns now to R1 guttural verbs. So those are the problems. But as always, there's some strong areas. There's some areas of the guttural verb, first R1 guttural verb, where we have strong categories that will look just like a strong verb. And those categories, of course, I list in section 3. And if you notice, the intensive stems, the PL, PUL, and HITHPIL, will look just like a strong verb even though you have a guttural in the R1 position. And then I also list some areas of the call, which you can read there in section 3, where again it's totally strong. And then I mentioned that if you would just to consider a composite schwa as a substitute for a vocal schwa, then there's even more areas of the call, and that will be considered strong. Well, now let's look at the remedies now for the weaknesses, for the areas where there is weaknesses. And that first area that we want to look at is the problem of the Dagesh forte. And this problem will only occur in the nifal. If you remember the nifal boxes, the nifal perfect and the nifal participle will be no problem for the Dagesh forte. But for all those forms that would follow this pattern, there's going to be a problem. The reason for this is here's R1 and it takes that Dagesh forte. Well, obviously, if you put a guttural here, if there's a guttural there, it will not accept the Dagesh forte, and so we're going to get a rejection. And so what we're going to end up having is something that looks like this. Rejection here, and then lengthening the hirik under the yod to a sere by compensation. And that's going to be the way we're going to remedy this weakness. And again, you can see that. Now if you look at 29-5, I discussed the remedy for the infirmity of vocal schwa. And again, this is a very simple situation where, again, in a strong verb, if you were to have a form like katol, notice here is your R1, and the R1 has a simple vocal schwa. But if we were to have a guttural in the R1 position, then instead of having a simple vocal schwa, we're obviously just going to have a composite schwa. And so the example I give you is azov. And notice here, under the ayin, we've got to have a composite schwa. And usually that composite schwa is a chetef patach, as you see here. But if you do get an R1 guttural that is an aleph, so for instance, the other example I give you, with emor, you're going to get the chetef segol, or again the 5-star general, the Douglas MacArthur form, as you see here. So sometimes the aleph will take the chetef segol as opposed to the chetef patach, which the other guttural letters will take. Now again, obviously resh will not be a problem for the schwas. Resh is a problem for Dagesh forte, but not for the schwa problem. So again, that's a pretty simple remedy. The more complicated remedies come now in section 6 when we deal with the rejection of the silent schwa. And the first thing we look at is the nifal, hifil, and hafal, and look at how these are going to be tackled. You'll also notice that as we go through these weak verbs, we normally leave the call to the end. The call is the most difficult aspect of the weak verb. usually your other stems, your nifal, pial, pual, hithpial, hifil, hafal, they have their forms are pretty stable. And normally you'll have no problem with those forms, or at least let's say a small problem. The call is always the most difficult part of the weak verb, and so we always say that to the end because of its difficulty. So let's now look at the remedy for the infirmity of guttural rejecting silent schwa for nifal, hifil, and hafal. Okay, the first thing we want to do is look at forms that with performatives have a patach. And so I list that as hifil imperfect, imperative, infinitives, and participles. And so let's look at an example of that. You see what I have written in the grammar, of course, is this form right here. And this is what you would expect for the hifil imperfect of this root ayin beit resh. And the ayin again is a guttural, and it's in the silent schwa position. But frequently, you will not get that silent schwa, and so what's going to happen is you're going to get a composite schwa, and that composite schwa always is going to echo the vowel under the performative. And therefore, if you have a patach as your performative, you're going to get the chetef patach under the R1 guttural, as you see here for the hifil imperfect. And so if patach is the performative, then a chetef patach will be your vocal schwa. Now you look at the second example. I talk about hirik sagol, and this one's slightly more complicated. Notice again we'll use the same root. We'll look at this root here. And again, this will be for some of the nifal and for also the hifil perfect. But let's do a nifal. A nifal perfect, what you would expect, again, is something like this. This is what you would expect. But with a hirik here, followed by the silent schwa, again, the guttural, being in the silent schwa position, it doesn't like that. And so what happens is not only is there a composite schwa going to be under the ayin, but also the hirik is going to go to sagol. So again, you get this sort of echo of a similar sound here. So again, these two always have to be in harmony. And so the hirik becomes a sagol to match the composite schwa, the chetef sagol, that you see under the R1 guttural. So again, this is what you would expect for this. And finally, the kametz chatuf situation. And again, let's just use the same root. And again, this is what we'd expect, and this is a kametz chatuf for the hafal. And the ayin, again, the silent schwa will often be rejected. And when it is rejected, you're going to get, again, the composite schwa, which again echoes this. So this would be no ozav, not na'azav. Don't say that. No ozav is what you would get here. And again, these have to be harmonized. So again, remember, we need harmony between these. You need these types of patterns here that I'm giving you. And again, you don't want to match it up something like this. You never want to have something combination like this. You know, this is the performative and this is your R1 guttural. You would never want to see something like this. You want these to harmonize again. Okay, well, now we do come to the call. And the call is always the most difficult part of weak verbs. And the problem with the call is that your performative can be one of two things. It can be either a sagol or a patach. Now, normally what you would expect so far from what you've learned is a form like yik tov. So you would expect your performative to be a hirik, but now we're really changing this and saying the performative for the call will either be a sagol or it will be a patach. Well, let's look at times where you're going to see sagol. Let's start with sagol. And so anytime you have a root, and again, here's a root, and let's say for your aton letter, your performative for the imperfect, the call imperfect, let's say it's an aleph, it's a 1CS. Anytime you have a 1CS performative, what you're going to have is the sagol option that's used. And so notice here, you're going to get the segols. The segol performative and the chetef segol for your, what really functions as the silent schwa, but it's not silent, it's vocal. So it's going to be there, though. Okay. Also, if the thematic vowel is a patach, so again, the example I give here is ahav, and the thematic vowel is a patach. Now again, you can get that for a standard verb, but all stative verbs, as you remember, has patach for the thematic vowel. When you get this situation, again, you're going to go with the segol route for your performative in the call. And so there are the segols that you see there. Another situation, suppose you have a root that begins with an R1 aleph. Again, if you get this type of situation, even though you have a holum for the thematic vowel, again, you will go with the segol route. And again, you can see that the presence of an aleph makes a big difference. So if aleph is the performative, or if aleph is the first root letter, that's where you're going to see segols. And again, if you get a patach as your thematic vowel, that's when you will also see segols. So you want to keep that in mind. Now the patach. When are we going to have patach as an option for the performative? Well, if you have a situation in which your thematic vowel is a holum, and under R1 is a guttural other than an aleph, then we're going to go the patach route. And so it's going to look like this. And so you're going to get a patach as your performative vowel, and then you will get the chetef patach under the R1. Now, in reality, this patach is the original performative vowel in Hebrew. The hirik is what they like to call an attenuation, a thinning of the vowel. And so, the yiktov form was, again, the theory is originally yaktob, which became yiktov in a closed unaccented syllable. But the original patach is truly preserved in some of these R1 guttural verbs, and that's what you're seeing in this situation. All right, and then one more example when you can have patach as your performative in the call. And that is, again, a standard verb. And by standard verb, again, we're talking about a holum as your thematic vowel. And with what we call a non-pausal form with a vocalic ending. And so the example I give is this. Here what we have is a form that has one of these vocalic endings, and it's not in pause. It's a non-pausal form. And when you have these non-pausal forms with a vocalic ending, instead of getting the segols that you would expect with an R1 aleph, instead you get the patachs, as you see here. And so that is the situation. Now, again, you'll notice here, this is not a composite schwa here. I will explain that just a little bit later, so hold on to that. But just remember, you're going to have patachs here. That's the main thing I want you to see here. Okay. Now, sometimes the form will actually take a silent schwa. Even though you have an R1 guttural, sometimes that R1 guttural will actually keep a silent schwa. And on occasion, that can affect the form. And let's look at it. If you have a form that has a hirik, as the example I give here in section 7 of chapter 29, you have this form here. And what you would expect to happen, of course, is, this is like the strong form of it. What you would expect the form to do is, of course, to go the segol route. And so, let me move this over a little bit. So you would expect something like this. But in reality, of course, let me draw that again. Let's put a patach under here. And then, let's do that. Okay, this is what you would expect as the answer for a nifal perfect third masculine singular. But sometimes the R1 guttural can actually hold the silent schwa. So if something's going to hold the silent schwa, what I would expect is you would have something like a hurric here. But in fact you don't. You actually get the segol. And so in order to figure these forms, if I say to you, work a certain form, but yet keep the schwa under the R1 position, what we need to do is, let me show what we need to do. Go ahead and work the form, first of all, as if it was a strong form with a dagesh lene here. But then go ahead and work it in such a way that it looks like it's not going to take the silent schwa. But then when you replace the silent schwa, leave the performative as it is. Just leave that performative here, and you will be fine. Now obviously if you do have a form with a composite schwa here, you'll have to get rid of the dagesh lene and the bait. But the form is going to keep the silent schwa, and you're going to have it here. And there's going to be a lengthening here secondarily, but I'll explain that when we get to R3 Aleph verbs. So just remember that and keep that in mind. Now if you look at section 8 of chapter 29, we have some final considerations. And one of these final considerations, we were just looking at it. And so in this form here, let me show you. Zav. Of course, this is what you'd expect in the singular. Ya'azov. But if we were to make this a plural form and add a vocalic ending, as you know, what you get is reduction of the thematic vowel. And so the original kametz chatuf is reduced to a vocal schwa, technically a political schwa. And now you have a situation in which you have a composite schwa under the R1 guttural, and now you have a political schwa under your R2 letter, and the Hebrew will not accept this. And so what's going to happen is the composite schwa will be promoted to patach in order to make the form. And another thing you need to watch out for is you do not put a dagesh in the R3 letter. There's a general rule: never put a dagesh lene, or for that reason a dagesh forte, in an R3 letter in Hebrew. But especially a dagesh lene, never think about doing that. This is again a political schwa. It is silent enough to close the syllable, but vocal enough to keep the dagesh lene out of the final letter there, if it's a bigad kafad, obviously. Now, one other thing I want to point out, this pattern here that we have is very similar to something we've already had. And again, if you think of the form na'ar with the 2ms, if you remember, we would end up at a situation again like this, where this is again a political schwa, and here we have the composite schwa. And remember, we did the same thing. We promoted that also into a patach, and so we ended up with a form that looked like this. And so again, this shouldn't really bother you. It's not the first time you've seen this type of phenomenon. And so again, there shouldn't be a lot of problems there. One other final consideration, and so look at number 2 under final considerations, and that is that if you were to add a pronominal suffix to these R1 gutturals, quite frequently you're going to get patachs, and I'm talking about the call. For your call R1 guttural verbs, usually you would expect a patach to be for your performative and also to go under your R1 guttural. Segols are not impossible. They do happen from time to time, but again, usually you get patachs and not gutturals. So now if you look at section 9, we have the summary of the adjustment to boxes. Clearly that's the problem, the major problem with the R1 guttural verbs. We have to adjust the boxes. And so you can look at 29-9. You can see in the left column I'll give you the strong verb. That's what you know so far. And then I have the R1 guttural with a silent schwa. And again, you can see for the hifil, for your R1 guttural with schwa, you get a segol as opposed to a hurric. And again, that's something we expect now. And in the far right column, as you look again in section 9, you can see an R1 guttural with a composite schwa, and you can see how we're adjusting the boxes. Also, look at the at number 4 under section 9, the call imperfect. Also look over those. Make sure you understand that. Normally we don't talk about the call having a box, but for this one case, we will sort of speak of the call as having a box. So keep that in mind. All right. Now we want to talk about the steps we need to do as we create and parse these forms. And so if you look at section 10, I talk about forming the call in weak verbs. And so we're going to follow 3 steps for this. First thing we're going to do is write the form as if it were a strong verb. And then the second step is we're going to identify the weakness that we have, the areas that are affected, and so forth. And then we'll make the proper adjustments that you learn in the chapter. So that's how we're going to form a call in the weak verb. And then in section 11, we talk about forming R1 guttural verbs. We basically follow the same pattern you learned for a strong verb. We're going to do boxes, and we're going to probably going to have to adjust boxes. And then the colors, and then the call. So there's just one adjustment. It's a slight adjustment, and that is to the boxes. And so we'll make that adjustment in the first step. And then basically it's going to be just like you've learned so far. So there's not a lot of new stuff here. So let's do the first example I have here. I have a Hiffel perfect 1CS of the root avar. And so again, the first step is the box. And so for the Hiffel perfect, you want something like this with the hey with the hierarch and the silent schwa. But again, we're dealing with an R1 guttural, so we have to make an adjustment. And so when we make that adjustment, we're going to have to go the way of segols, because we have a hierarch here, and when you have a hierarch on your performative, we're going to go the segol route. So this is really the box down here that we're going to work off of. The next step is the colors. There's nothing different there. Again, the colors are going to look like this. And then finally, we're going to have the call, and that form is going to be katalti. So we now will write the verb. And I'm going to do this in the order of the steps that you're supposed to do. Here's the verb. And so the first thing is the box is attached. And again, this is what you would expect with a strong verb, but we're dealing with an R1 guttural of the Hiffel perfect. And so we go the segol route like this. The next thing is the colors. Remember, we're dealing with a 1CS. If we were dealing with one of the 3s, a 3MS, 3FS, or 3CP, we'd have the long hierarch yod. But we're not dealing with that. We're dealing with a 1CS, so we're going to get a patach here for the thematic vowel. And then again, for the call, it's katal T for your 1CS, so we'll add the T form here right at the end. Put the accent here, and this would be the answer that you want. He varti is the answer you want. And again, I give an explanation for that, and you can read that. The next thing we want to do is look at forming a call, and that's what number 2 is here in section 11. A call imperfect 2MS avar again, same root, avar. And notice I give you the thematic vowels, and so we can go ahead, if you please, and put the thematic vowel there. But again, the first thing we want to do is make it like a strong verb. And for a strong verb, you would expect something like this. With the hierarch here, again, yiktol, that's what you would expect. And if you had a silent schwa here, obviously there'd be a dogish lane here. But we might as well go ahead and get rid of this because it's not going to stand for long. So we have this, and now we know what the problem is. The problem, the second step we must make here is what's the problem? Well, we have an R1 guttural, and we've got to make a decision. Do we go the segol route, or do we go the patach route? You see, that's what we've got to do. That's the real problem, and now we've got to make the adjustments. Well, when do we go segol? When do we go patach? Well, basically, you go the segol route if you have an aleph as your performative, your 1CS. We don't have that. Or if you have an aleph as your R1 guttural. We don't have an aleph there either. Or if your thematic vowel is a patach, then we would have the segols. But we don't have any of that. And therefore, we have to go patachs. We want to go patachs. And so that's what we're going to have. And this would be your answer. This is a standard verb with a holum thematic vowel. And with an ayin, chet, if you have an ayin or a chet or a hey as your R1, then you're going to go the patach route. That's what you get, and of course this is your answer. But here, we have to make an adjustment because it's a 2ms, and so we will put the tav as opposed to the yod, and so this is our final answer, ta'avor. Okay, ta'avor. All right, and again, now I talk about the parsing of the weak verb. And again, as we parse, it's going to be identical. We're going to use, again, the same 3 steps, and it's a process of elimination. And so look at the example that I give you. The example that I give you here, I tell you what, I'll do a different one as opposed to the example I've given you. Let me do the, let's do a hifil. Well, let me just give you a form. Maybe that'd be better. Let's do a form like this. Let's do a form like this. Okay. I'll tell you what, let's make it just a little more interesting. Suppose we have a form that looks like this here. Now we want to parse it. So again, what we have to do is follow our steps. We're going to do boxes, colors, and call. And as we look at this, we can see here we've got a guttural, and we have another guttural here. Of course, as you know, at this stage, your root is going to be 3 root letters. But yet I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters here. So in all probability, this is going to be a performative. And this is some type of ending here. And these are your 3 root letters here. So as I look at it, I see an aleph with a patach under it. And so the first thing I would do in my mind is go through my regular boxes. And what you want is something like, you know it's going to be a yod for your box. You're looking for something like this. And so really, right off the bat, I'm thinking of a hifil imperfect. However, we've got to be careful here, because now the call imperfect can also look like this with the options that you can have with patach now. So really, the 2 options we have now are the hifil imperfect or the call imperfect. But the thematic vowel that I wrote up here in my form, the thematic vowel is a hirik yod. Well, that's going to be the end of the call. So we can eliminate the call by the thematic vowel. This thematic vowel clearly is the thematic vowel for the hifil. And so what we're looking at here is some type of hifil imperfect, because this aleph here is a 1cs, matching the boxes for an R1 guttural. And then there is your thematic vowel, the hirik yod. And now all we have to do is explain this ending. And if we go through the imperfect call, if we go through the regular imperfects, we're not going to find it, but you got to remember, you got to go through a form like ektala, which is the cohortative, and that's what you have here. This is a cohortative ending, and so as you parse this from the call, you've got to remember this is a cohortative ending, and that would give you the answer of a hifil imperfect first common singular cohortative is what we're looking at here, and so that is the form for that. So again, remember, we have to do a process of elimination when we do parsing. And now I'll go down to 3. Let me look at that with you. You have a form that is this. Okay, in this form here, again, as you look at boxes, you can see right here that this would again be a box that would be very similar to a hifil imperfect. But when you go to the next step, which is your thematic vowel, there's no way to explain the holum. So this is not a hifil. The holum is clear as a clear sign of a call. And yet, with an R1 guttural, it can take a silent schwa and it can take a patach here under your performative. We're looking at call here. So we do boxes, but as soon as we do colors, we go, that's not working. We're going to have to go to the call, and so now we switch to the steps of the call. And so notice we switch to the call steps. We've eliminated the boxes. This would be a very similar form to, again, something like a yiktol, but again, we get the patach. And again, that's what happens when these gutturals retain a silent schwa. You could have gotten, well, you get a patach here, of course, or it's possible, had this been an aleph, you could have gotten a sagol here. And so we've got to watch out for these types of forms. So again, what do we have here? In this situation, what we have is a call imperfect 3ms. And so